On the morning of September 22, 2026, a line of white trucks began forming on the county road that led to the old Hemlock place. This was unusual. The only traffic that road usually saw was Clements Hemlock's own dusty pickup and the occasional lost tourist looking for the interstate. But these were not tourists. These were long-haul grain trucks, their chrome grills gleaming in the early autumn sun, their air brakes hissing with an expensive patience. By 10 o'clock, the line stretched for half a mile, past the rusted mailbox and around the bend where the wild sunflowers grew thick. In the fading grain elevator town of Harmony, 5 miles down the road, this did not go unnoticed. Phones began to ring. Frank Hemlock, Clements's father, got the first call while he was having coffee at the diner. It was from a neighbor whose land bordered theirs. The neighbor wanted to know if Clements was selling out. Frank, his hand trembling slightly as he held the receiver, said he didn't know a thing about it. He paid for his coffee and drove out toward the farm, a knot of familiar worry tightening in his stomach. For 8 years, that worry had been his constant companion. The trucks were from every major agricultural corporation in the American Great Plains. Their logos represented billions of dollars in capital, research, and logistics. They were parked on the shoulder of a road leading to a 160-acre farm that, by every modern metric, was a failure. The farm had been running at a fraction of the yield of its neighbors for nearly a decade. Its owner, a quiet woman who was not yet 30, had been the subject of pity, scorn, and outright ridicule at the local co-op. Now, the titans of the industry had come to her, hats in hand, their empty trucks a silent testament to a world turned upside down. To understand why those trucks were there and why their drivers waited so respectfully for Clements Hemlock to finish her morning chores before she would even speak to them, you have to go back 8 years. You have to understand the land, the wheat, and the choice a young woman made that everyone, from her own father to the regional commodity brokers, told her was a form of slow, deliberate suicide. The story really begins 8 years earlier, in the spring of 2018. Clements was 21, home from a 2-year agricultural science program at the State College, a program she had quit 6 months shy of a degree. Her grandfather had just been buried in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church, and the farm, his life's work and his father's before that, was now hers. It was a poisoned inheritance. Decades of modern farming, of chasing higher yields with more inputs, had left the soil tired and the farm's finances precarious. The bank held the note, and the bank was not sentimental. Her father, Frank, sat her down at the kitchen table. He was a good man, a mechanic who had left the farm for the steady paycheck of a town job years ago. He loved his daughter, but he was a man who believed in practicality. He spread the papers before her, the debt schedule, the input costs for the coming season, the forward contract prices offered by the regional grain co-op. "Clem," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "we have to be smart about this. The co-op is offering a decent price for number 2 hard red winter. If you plant the Apex 770 seed like everyone else and we get good rain, you can clear the note for the year. We can keep our heads above water." Clements looked at the papers, at the columns of numbers that reduced the complex cycles of soil, sun, and rain to a simple profit and loss statement. She slid them back across the table. "I'm not planting Apex 770. Frank sighed. It was a long, weary sound. What are you going to plant then? There's nothing else that will make grade. Nothing else that will yield enough. Grandpa's wheat, she said quietly. Frank stared at her. He thought of the small collection of dusty canvas sacks in the back of the old barn, filled with the dark, slender kernels of a wheat variety no one had grown commercially in 50 years. It was a relic, a piece of his own father's stubborn sentimentality. Turkey red? Clements, that's not even a registered variety anymore. It's a museum piece. The co-op won't even buy it. It doesn't fit their specs. The yield is half of a modern hybrid. I know, she said. I'm not selling to the co-op. The silence in the kitchen was heavy with the weight of generations. To a farmer in that part of the world, not selling to the co-op was like a sailor refusing to use the ocean. It was the only system that existed. It was the buyer of last resort and the buyer of first resort. It was everything. Then who are you going to sell to? Frank asked, his voice strained. How are you going to pay the bills? I'll find a way, she said, her quietness a wall he couldn't breach. I'll sell it myself. Her younger brother, Eli, then a teenager, overheard the conversation from the living room. He thought his sister had lost her mind. Selling it herself? Who would buy a few hundred bushels of weird, old-fashioned wheat? He was embarrassed. His friends' fathers farmed thousands of acres, drove new combines, and talked about futures markets. His sister was planning to farm like it was 1920. The next week, Clements went to the co-op, not to sign a contract, but to close her grandfather's account. The manager, a man who had known her since she was a child, tried to reason with her. He laid out the same logic her father had. He was kind at first, then condescending. Look, Clements, he said, leaning back in his chair. I know you're grieving. But farming is a business now. It's not about sentiment. This turkey red stuff, it's a hobby. You can't run a farm on a hobby. You'll be broke by winter. He smiled, a thin, knowing smile. You'll never make it alone. Clements didn't argue. She just nodded, took the final statement, and walked out. When she got home, she took a slip of paper and wrote down his words, "You'll never make it alone." She taped it to the wall above the old wooden desk in the corner of her kitchen, right next to a faded photograph of her grandfather standing in a field of tall, golden wheat. Let me tell you about the wheat, because it's where the story really begins. The wheat was called Turkey Red. It was not an invention of a corporate laboratory. It had no patent, no trademark, no glossy marketing brochure. It was a landrace wheat, which means it was not a single, uniform variety, but a diverse population of genetically related plants, a product of centuries of selection by farmers, not scientists. It had been carried to the American Great Plains in the 1870s by Mennonite immigrants from the Ukraine. They brought it with them in small wooden chests, a piece of their old world to plant in the new. It was this wheat that turned the plains into the breadbasket of the world. It was a hard red winter wheat, planted in the fall, that could survive the harsh, dry winters and ripen under the hot summer sun. Its roots grew deep, sometimes more than 6 feet into the soil, searching for moisture long after the shallow-rooted prairie grasses had gone dormant. This deep root system made it remarkably drought-tolerant. Its height, often reaching a man's chest, allowed it to outcompete weeds for sunlight, reducing the need for herbicides. But its most important characteristic was its diversity. In a field of turkey red, not every plant was identical. Some were a little taller, some a little shorter. Some ripened a day or two earlier, some a day or two later. Some had a slightly higher resistance to one type of rust, others to another. This genetic chaos was its strength. It was a collective, a community of plants that had adapted over generations to the specific challenges of its environment. It was resilient. By the latter half of the 20th century, this resilience was seen as a flaw. The logic of industrial agriculture demanded uniformity. It needed every plant to be the same height so the combine harvester could be set at a single level. It needed every plant to ripen on the same day for a single, efficient harvest. It needed every plant to respond identically to chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So, plant breeders began to select for these traits. They took the old landraces like Turkey Red and began to isolate specific genes, breeding for shorter stalks, higher yields, and perfect uniformity. The result was modern wheat, like the Apex 770 her father wanted her to plant. It was a marvel of engineering. On paper, it was superior in every way. Its yield per acre, given enough water and nitrogen fertilizer, was double that of its ancestor. Its stalks were short and stout, bred to carry the weight of their unnaturally heavy grain heads without falling over. It was a perfect commodity, each kernel indistinguishable from the next, designed to be harvested, transported, and milled with maximum efficiency. But in the drive for this optimized uniformity, something essential had been lost. The genetic diversity that gave Turkey Red its resilience was bred out. The deep root systems were traded for shallow ones that were more efficient at absorbing surface-applied fertilizers. The plants became dependent, delicate thoroughbreds that could perform spectacularly under ideal conditions, but were hopelessly fragile when faced with the unexpected. They were a monoculture, a vast, identical army of clones, and a monoculture is exquisitely vulnerable. If a disease or pest could overcome the defenses of one plant, it could overcome them all. The system's greatest strength, its uniformity, was also its most profound weakness. Clements had learned this not just in her college textbooks, but in her grandfather's barn. He had saved the seed not out of pure sentiment, but out of a deep, bone-felt skepticism of the new way. He had seen the cycle of new seed, new pest, new chemical, and he didn't trust it. He saw it as a treadmill, a system that sold solutions to problems it had itself created. He taught Clements how to read the land, not a soil analysis report. He taught her that resilience was more important than yield, that a farm's true wealth was in the life of its soil, not the balance in its bank account. So, when Clements chose to plant the Turkey Red, she wasn't just choosing a seed. She was choosing a different philosophy. She was rejecting the logic of the spreadsheet and embracing the logic of the ecosystem. She was betting on the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 anonymous farmers over the confident assertions of a handful of corporate agronomists. It was a lonely and, by all appearances, a foolish bet. The first 2 years were the hardest. That first fall, she prepared a small 40-acre plot according to her grandfather's methods. She didn't use the heavy industrial plow that inverted the soil, but a chisel plow that broke it up while leaving the organic matter on the surface. She planted the Turkey Red with an old drill she'd repaired herself. The neighbors watched from their pickup trucks on the county road. They saw her working alone, a small figure in a vast landscape. They shook their heads. When the wheat came up, it didn't look like their fields. Theirs were perfect carpets of uniform green. Hers was patchy, uneven. The plants were of varying heights. To their eyes, it looked messy, weedy, neglected. The first harvest was a confirmation of their doubts. The yield was, as her father and the co-op manager had predicted, barely half of what her neighbors got from their Apex 770. After saving enough seed for the next year's planting, she had only a few hundred bushels left to sell. And there was nowhere to sell it. The co-op wouldn't take it. The grain elevators were set up for massive quantities of a uniform commodity. Her small, odd lot was a logistical headache they didn't want. Frank watched his daughter, his heart aching. He saw her exhausted at the end of each day, her hands calloused, her face streaked with dirt. He saw the meager pile of grain in the old wooden bin. The bank payment was coming due. He offered to co-sign a loan to help her buy the right seed for the next year. Just for one season, Clem, he pleaded. Just to get us back on our feet. She refused, gently but unshakably. I have to see this through, Dad. She spent that first winter in the barn, working on a machine she'd bought at a farm auction for $200. It was an antique seed cleaner, a complex contraption of screens, fans, and augers. It was obsolete technology replaced by massive, centralized seed processing plants. It took her months to restore it, sourcing parts online, machining new ones herself in her father's workshop. Eli, her brother, watched her with a mixture of pity and frustration. He was in high school, and the shame of their failing farm was acute. Why are you wasting your time with that old junk? He asked her one evening, as she was painstakingly calibrating one of the screens. Because this isn't junk, she replied, not looking up. This lets me control my own seed. It lets me select for the plants that do best right here, in our soil. I'm not just cleaning the grain, Eli, I'm helping it adapt. I'm guiding its evolution. He didn't understand. It just looked like cleaning seeds to him. With her meticulously cleaned grain, she faced her next problem: what to do with it. She couldn't sell it as a commodity. So, she decided to transform it. She took a small portion of her savings and bought a small stone grist mill, a countertop model from Austria. She began to teach herself to mill flour. It was another slow, painstaking process. She learned about extraction rates, about bran and germ, about how the heat of the milling process could affect the flavor and nutritional quality of the flour. The flour she produced was unlike anything available in the local grocery store. It was a pale golden color, flecked with bran. It had a nutty, complex aroma. When she baked with it, the bread had a deep, rich flavor that was almost savory. It tasted of the sun and the soil it came from. It had character. She packed the flour into simple brown paper bags, which she stamped by hand with a logo she'd designed, a single stalk of tall wheat. She started selling it at a farmer's market in a city 60 miles away, the only place she could find that had customers willing to pay a premium for artisanal products. She'd wake up at 4 in the morning every Saturday, load her old pickup, and drive 2 hours to set up her stall. The first few months, she barely sold enough to cover the cost of gas. People were skeptical. The flour was expensive. It didn't look like the bleached, sterile white flour they were used to. But a few people tried it. They were home bakers, foodies, people who cared about where their food came from. And they came back the next week. And they told their friends. Slowly, a tiny business began to form. She started a simple website, a mailing list. She wrote about the history of the wheat, about her grandfather, about the health of the soil. She wasn't just selling flour, she was selling a story. A true story. By the third and fourth year, things had started to shift. She had a small but loyal customer base. She had expanded her planting to 80 acres. The farm was still not profitable by any conventional measure, but it was breaking even. It was surviving. Frank's worry began to subside, replaced by a quiet, confused pride. He didn't understand his daughter's business model, but he could no longer deny that it was, somehow, working. Eli, now in his last years of high school, started helping her. He began by bagging the flour, then running the mill, then helping with the harvest. He was still skeptical, but he was also observant. He saw the passion in the bakers who drove out from the city to see the fields. He tasted the difference in the bread. He started to understand that there were other economies, other ways of valuing things than the one he heard about at the co-op. The turning point came in her 5th year. An article appeared in a national food magazine written by a prominent baker who had discovered her flour. He wrote about the turkey red wheat as a lost American treasure. He described its superior baking qualities, its complex flavor, its nutritional density. He wrote about Clements not as a backward-looking hobbyist, but as a visionary, a seed keeper who was preserving a vital piece of agricultural heritage. Overnight, her world changed. Her website crashed from the traffic. Her inbox was flooded with orders from bakeries and restaurants across the country. Suddenly, she had more demand than she could possibly supply. She had to start a waiting list. The price for her flour, and for the wheat berries themselves, skyrocketed. She was no longer competing with the commodity market. She had created her own market, one based on quality, story, and scarcity. She was now making far more per acre than her neighbors, even with her lower yields. She was paying her bills, investing in better equipment, and slowly, methodically, healing the soil on her farm. The looks she got in town were no longer of pity, but of grudging respect and a deep, abiding confusion. They still didn't understand it. In their world, wheat was wheat. You grew as much of it as you could, as cheaply as you could, and you sold it by the ton to the elevator. Clements was selling it by the pound, in 5-pound paper bags, for a price that seemed absurd. She was operating in a different reality. It was in the fall of her 7th year of this lonely work, in 2025, that the system she had rejected came knocking on her door. A shiny new SUV pulled into her driveway, and out stepped a man in a crisp polo shirt and expensive boots. His name was Garrett, a young, ambitious regional manager for the same agribusiness conglomerate that manufactured Apex 770 and supplied the co-op. He was not hostile. He was smooth, articulate, and armed with data. He had heard about her success and was intrigued. He saw it as an inefficiency in the market, an opportunity. He sat with her at her kitchen table, the same table where she had argued with her father 7 years earlier. He spread out his own set of papers, this time on a tablet computer. "Clements," he began, his tone friendly, collegial, "we've been following your progress. It's impressive what you've done, creating a niche brand. It's a great story. But it's not scalable." He pulled up a spreadsheet. "Here's your acreage. Here's your estimated yield. Here's your public-facing price point. Now, here's what you could be doing." He swiped the screen. A new set of numbers appeared, glowing and seductive. "This is our new variety, Apex 900. Genetically optimized for your soil type. We project a yield of over 100 bushels an acre. We can offer you a premium contract above the co-op price for the entire harvest. We want to create a branded heritage-style flower line. You'd be the face of it. We handle the marketing, the distribution, the logistics. You just farm. He saw himself as offering her a lifeline, a way to graduate from the minor leagues to the big time. He was offering to solve her problems, to absorb her into the efficient, powerful system he represented. Clemence listened patiently. She looked at his glowing screen, at the numbers that promised so much. They were the same numbers, the same logic she had been rejecting her entire life. "You're measuring the wrong thing," she said, her voice calm and even. Garrett laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "We're measuring profit. Bushels per acre. Return on investment. In this business, that's the only metric that matters." "I measure resilience," she said. "I measure the depth of the roots. I measure the life in the soil. I measure the number of different genes in each harvest. I'm not running a business, Garrett. I'm stewarding a system. Your Apex 900, it's not resilient. It's a dependent. It can't survive without all the other products you sell. The fertilizer, the fungicide, the herbicide. It's a closed loop. My wheat can survive on its own." He stared at her, genuinely baffled. He was speaking the language of economics, of progress, of modern agriculture. She was speaking a language he didn't recognize. It sounded like poetry, like religion. It had no place on a balance sheet. "You're leaving a fortune on the table," he said, shaking his head as he packed up his tablet. "For what? A story?" "For the future," she said. He drove away, convinced she was a fool, a romantic Luddite who was clinging to an obsolete past. He did not know that the future she was talking about was less than a year away. The crisis began subtly, the following spring of 2026. It started as whispers, as concerned posts on farming forums online. A new strain of stem rust had been identified. Stem rust is a fungus, the ancient enemy of wheat. For decades, it had been controlled by fungicides and by breeding resistant wheat varieties. But this new strain, which scientists were calling UG99K2, was different. It was hyper-aggressive, and it was devastatingly effective against the specific gene SCR31, which provided resistance in most modern wheat hybrids, including the entire Apex line. The weather that summer was a perfect storm. It was unusually warm and wet across the Great Plains. The humidity was high. These were ideal conditions for the fungus to reproduce. The rust spores, light as dust, traveled on the wind, moving north from the southern fields in great, invisible clouds. When it hit, it was faster and more complete than anyone had imagined. A field that looked healthy and green on Monday would have a few telltale orange pustules on its stems by Wednesday. By Friday, the entire field would be a sickening yellow-brown, the stems weakened and collapsing, the developing grain inside the heads starved of nutrients and shriveling into useless husks. The chemical companies rushed to respond, but their fungicides were ineffective. The rust had evolved a resistance. Panic set in. The commodity markets went into a frenzy. Wheat futures shot to historic highs. But it was paper wheat. The physical wheat, the actual grain in the fields, was gone. From Texas to Nebraska, an entire year's crop was being wiped out in the space of a few weeks. It was an agricultural apocalypse, a catastrophe born of uniformity. The entire system, so efficient and productive, had been revealed as a fragile house of cards, and the wind had started to blow. On Clemence's farm, things were different. She walked her fields every morning, her heart in her throat. She saw the rust. It was there. The spores had come to her farm just as they had to every other. She found plants whose stems were covered in the orange pustules, their life draining away. But right next to them, she found other plants, their stems green and healthy, that were completely untouched. Her field was not a monoculture. It was a diverse population. The turkey red landrace contained a multitude of different resistance genes, a library of defenses built up over centuries. UG99K2 could defeat some of them, but it couldn't defeat them all. The rust could take a plant here, a plant there, but it couldn't sweep through the field in an unstoppable wave. The genetic diversity acted as a firebreak. Her field was damaged, her yield would be lower than she had hoped. But there would be a harvest. In a year when the breadbasket of the world had failed, Clemence hemlock had a crop. Which brings us back to the morning of September 22nd and the line of trucks on the county road. The news had spread through the agricultural world with the speed of a wildfire. A farmer in Kansas had a viable harvest of a heritage wheat that was resistant to UG99K2. The trucks were not there to buy her grain for milling. Her few thousand bushels were a drop in the ocean of global demand. They were there for her seed. That seed, once dismissed as a worthless relic, was now the most valuable agricultural commodity on the planet. It was the only hope for the next planting season. It held the genetic key to surviving the plague. Clemence finally walked out to the road just after noon. Eli was with her. Frank stood on the porch, watching, the worry in his face finally, after 8 long years, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated awe. The first man to meet her was a senior executive from a seed genetics company, a man who had flown in on a private jet that morning. He offered her a price per bushel that was more than she had expected to earn in a decade. She shook her head. "I'm not selling by the bushel." The executive was confused. "How else would you sell it?" "I'm not selling grain," she said. "I'm selling a genetic resource. And I'm not selling it to the highest bidder. I'm allocating it." Over the next few hours, she laid out her terms. She would sell a portion of her seed to the large corporations and research universities at a price that was staggeringly high. She was not a fool. She knew what it was worth. They needed it to begin the long, slow process of breeding new resistant hybrids. But she held back more than half of her harvest. That portion, she announced, was for any farmer within a 500-mile radius who was willing to sign a contract. Not a sales contract, but a stewardship contract. They would get the seed for a fraction of the corporate price, on the condition that they would plant it, save their own seed from the harvest, and in turn, share that seed with 2 of their neighbors the following year. She was not just selling a product, she was launching a movement. She was rebuilding a resilient, decentralized system from the ashes of the centralized one. Standing in the back of the line of buyers, holding a purchase order authorized at a panic-inducing price, was Garrett. His company, whose apex seeds had been wiped out completely, was desperate. Their entire business model was on the verge of collapse. He was there to buy a future for his company from the very woman whose wisdom he had dismissed as a sentimental story. When his turn came, he approached her, his face pale, his earlier confidence gone. He didn't try to negotiate. He just handed her the tablet with the wire transfer authorization form. She looked at it, then looked at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet, resolute calm. "You were right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were measuring the right thing." She signed the tablet and handed it back. "It's time everyone started," she said. In the months that followed, the money from the seed sales settled in her bank account. It was a life-changing sum. But Clemence did not buy a new truck or a bigger house. She continued to live in the old farmhouse, to drive her old pickup, to work the land. One day that winter, a for sale sign went up in front of the co-op building in town. The collapse of the harvest had pushed it into bankruptcy. The system it had served had failed, and it had failed along with it. Clemence made an offer the same week. She bought the building, the silos, and the elevators. The town buzzed with rumors. They thought she had bought it as a final act of vindication, a trophy to commemorate her victory over the men who had laughed at her. They were wrong. The following spring, she reopened the facility. But it was not the same co-op. She had converted it. One of the large silos was now a dedicated, climate-controlled seed bank for heritage and landrace grains, open to any farmer who wanted to deposit or withdraw seeds. The main warehouse was now a community-owned stone mill and bagging facility, allowing other local farmers who had joined her stewardship program to process and market their own flour directly. She didn't just save her own farm. She created the infrastructure for 100 other farms to do the same. Her brother, Eli, came home from his first year of college, a degree in business now looking pale and thin compared to the real-world education he'd received on the farm. He became her full partner, managing the new co-op, his earlier skepticism replaced by a fierce, quiet devotion to the philosophy his sister had championed. Her father, Frank, retired from his mechanic job and spent his days at the farm, not working, but simply being there, his presence a quiet apology and a profound thank you. The story of Clemence Hemlock became a quiet legend in the plains. It is a story that illustrates a fundamental truth about the world we have built. The modern system, with its emphasis on efficiency, scale, and uniformity, is a powerful thing. It can produce incredible abundance under a predictable set of circumstances. Its logic is the logic of the spreadsheet, where every variable is known and every outcome can be calculated. It is a system that is strong, but brittle. The old way, the way of Clemence and her grandfather, operates on a different logic. It is the logic of the ecosystem. It values diversity over uniformity, resilience over raw output, and health over speed. It understands that the unexpected is not a possibility, but an inevitability. It measures its success not in a single season's bumper crop, but in its ability to produce a crop, however modest, in every season, good or bad. It is a system that appears inefficient, but it is durable. The conflict between these two worldviews is the conflict of our time. It is the spreadsheet versus the soil. It is the quarterly report versus the 7-generation view. One path offers the seductive promise of short-term optimization and maximum profit. The other offers the quiet, unglamorous, and difficult work of building something that lasts. For 8 years, a young woman on a small farm chose the harder path. She was told she was a fool clinging to the past. It turned out she was a prophet building the future.